Hi everyone, I'm Jen from Yarnia, Montclair, New Jersey's local yarn store, and our podcast, The Chronicles of Yarnia, which you can watch on our YouTube channel. Visit us online at shopyarnia.com, and today I'm going to show you how to make a circle weaving using an embroidery hoop or a macrame hoop. So the materials that we're using here, we have as kits at Yarnia, but you can also gather them around, and we have an embroidery hoop. I'm using a wood one here. I suggest you use one that you like the looks of. And then we are going to warp it with some smooth cotton yarn, like a mercerized cotton or crochet cotton, like I have here. We have some wool roving, also called top, which is this big fluffy fiber. And we have leftover yarns of various colors. I've gathered a couple from my random stash of yarns, a tapestry needle, and some scissors. So we are going to get started. This is a version of a weft-faced tapestry weave. What that means is we will mostly see the yarn that we are using to go over and under. The warp yarn, that's this, is the thinner yarn that makes the spider web structure we'll be weaving onto. The weft yarn is the yarn and the fiber that goes over and under the warp yarn. So first thing we're going to do is I'm going to remove the outer hoop of the embroidery hoop, and I'm going to set it aside. We're going to use this at the end to finish our frame. Then I am going to tie on my warp yarn with just plain old knots. I'm going to double knot it so it stays a little bit tight. In general, you want to make sure that you're weaving your warp yarn stays firm and tight. It's a little loose, but it's fine. So in order to warp the yarn, we're going to go across and under, and we're going to wrap the butterfly around, and I'm going to pull snug. I like to keep it snug because it just is a little bit easier to weave with. Don't worry too much about your tail. In my case, I'm actually going to catch it here. We're going to keep going around. If you notice, I go around the frame and I come back under again and around again before I crisscross over. That just gives you a little bit of extra sturdiness. Now I am at the end of my spider web, and I could either wrap this around the edge, or what I can do is I can also use this now to go around and tighten up the center of our wheel. And I'm actually going to do that, holding it down to pinch it. I'm going to thread my tapestry needle. I'm going to thread the end of the, I can let go of that. I'm going to thread my needle, and I'm just going to snug everything up. The reason I'm not completing this is because it's going to be easier for me to go over and under each warp thread and have it come out even if I skip one spoke. And that's because when you go over one yarn, go over one warp thread, you want to go under the next. The next time you come around, you want to go under this one and over that one. And so if you didn't do this, skip one spoke, you would have to either skip or double up on a warp string when you come back around to it, which is totally fine. You can do that. So if you notice what I did, I threaded my needle and then I kind of dove back down and I'm wrapping it around. I'm coming up another spoke and I'm going down its opposite, and I'm pulling it tight, taking tiny little almost back stitches or running stitches to snug up that center of my spider web. And you can take as many or as few as you want. I recommend at least 2, just so you have a nice snug look. And let's do one more. And then what I'm going to do is, before I dive this down in the back, I am going to adjust the spokes on my wheel just like that to see, okay, is it where I want? Now I'm going to look at this side and see, do I like the way that this looks? And then I'm going to look at that side and see, do I like the way that that looks? Pick your right side now. I'm going to pick this as my right side. And what I'm actually going to do is I'm just going to go under one of the warp threads and kind of secure this just so I don't have to keep yanking on it. So on my wrong side, I'm going to tie a little knot around one of the warp threads. Now I don't need to hold it quite so tight. And now what I'm going to do is, I have this warp thread still attached. I like to use it to make a little center medallion. You can see on the finished one, there's a tiny little center of white. That's what we're doing here. So I'm just going to come up somewhere, doesn't matter where, and I'm going to go over one warp thread. If you notice, the warp threads are actually doubled. Right now I'm going to use them as, I'm going to pretend they're one spoke. So I'm going over one spoke and under the next. And you continue this way around, over, under, over, under, over, under, all the way around. That's good. So I'm going to bring this to the back of my work, and I'm just going to snug it under something. Use my needle and jam it under something. And this is just to keep it secure and out of the way. In this case, I'm going to kind of secure it with a knot. If you guys know me in person, you know that I'm not a big fan of knots in my work unless I'm weaving. Weaving, knot away. Knock yourself out. Okay, so I'm going back to the front. If you notice, I'm ignoring this warp strand here, and I'm not too fussed about the wrong side. Now I'm going to pick my next color. I am going to start doing a plain weave, and I think I'm going to start with this purple I have here. Now I can either thread my needle with a length of purple, which I think I'm going to do. I'm going to cut a length and thread my tapestry needle, or you can also just use your fingers. You don't always have to use a tapestry needle. When we come to doing the wool roving, I'm going to suggest not using a tapestry needle. It's nearly impossible to thread a tapestry needle with wool roving, so let's not do that. I can come up where I left off. I honestly don't remember where I left off, so I'm just going to come up here. Take your pick. Leave a little bit of a tail, or in my case, because my tail is a little bit puffy, what I'm going to do, and I'm going to take advantage of my doubled warp thread. See, I have a little bit of space in there. I'm just going to tuck my tail right in it, and then maybe right into the next one. And that'll just keep it out of the way as I go over and under again. So I am going to take a quick look. I can see, and I'm not sure if you can see quite so well, but right here I had gone under this warp thread the last round. So now I'm going to go over it and pull through the extra. There we go. So I'm going to go under, over, under, over. It's almost like a running stitch at this point, or if you ever did in preschool or in kindergarten, those placemats out of construction paper where you cut strips and you go over, under, over, under. That is exactly what this is right here. So we are using our warp as our frame, kind of our spider web, and we are packing our weft, which is the pretty color, down over. Now, one of the things that I like to do is I like to play with the symmetry of the circle. We have a bit more around, and rather than make this look like a pure bullseye, I'm going to work back this way a bit and build it up so it's off kilter. So I'm going to go down this one, and then I'm just going to turn around. I'm going to go back the other way for a little bit. And weaving, you can do this, no problem. You can go back and forth, stop in the middle of a row, build up, you can make shapes. Just keep in mind that when you're working a circle weave, you're working with the radial lines of the warp. And so it's a little bit easier to work with them than to try to work against them. So I'm not going to go all the way around. I'm going to stop here and I'm going to work backwards again. I think I'll stop a little short of the last one I stopped to. That one ball of yarn is getting in my way. Now I'm not going to pull too tight because I don't want to separate that too much. The one thing that you want to keep an eye out for when you're doing this plain or tabby weave of over under is that when you do something textured next to it, the tabby weave tends to disappear a little bit and lose a bit of impact. That's not a bad thing. I actually really like that. But what I want to make sure I don't do is that I don't stop short of my purple. I want to make sure that I have enough impact with my purple color. So I'm going to do just weave a little bit more than I think I might want because I'm going to go with some roving next, and that's going to overshadow the purple a little bit. So if we see, so this plain or tabby weave can be done with anything. You can do this with your regular yarn. You could do it with your roving. You could do it with leather straps. You could do it with ribbon. Any of those things can be used in weaves. Now, in this case, I'm going to go all the way around because I want to kind of smooth this out a bit. I still want it to be a lopsided circle, but I want it to be a little bit smoother before I move on to my next color. To end the yarn, You can either weave until you're done with the yarn, or again, we're going to dive down to the back, turn it over. This is my initial tail, and I'm just going to tuck it under one or two strands. Because I wove this relatively tight and I'm using a needle, it's pretty easy to do, and I'll just trim. I leave a little bit out just so I don't have to worry about it coming undone. Again, this isn't a structural weave, so you don't have to worry too much about it popping out later. It'll mostly stay put. So now I have, I'm going to trim this a little bit. Boop. Trim this a little bit. Now I'm going to look at the rovings that I have and see what color I want to do next. So here are a couple. I have that hot pink. This one, which has a little green in it. I think this is the same. So I'm going to move that over. I have a pale pink. We have this pretty one that goes from magenta to blue. I think I'm going to use this magenta to blue one. I'm going to put the others to the side and I'll come back to them. Now, when you're working with roving, roving is unspun wool or mohair or cashmere or whatever. Don't cut roving with scissors. It leaves a hard edge that's harder to disappear. What you want to do is just want to pull it apart. If you're finding it difficult to pull apart, move your hands a little bit further apart. That'll definitely help. If you have a thick chunk of roving, you can split it vertically. Just pull it apart and it'll split. And I think I'm going to do that a couple of times with this so I can have a couple of different ways to place my color rather than have a thick poofy one. I'm also doing a smaller scale weave, so I think that looks a little bit nicer. And I think I'm going to start with the pink end. Now what I'm going to show you with this roving is how to do a technique called sumac. That's S-O-U-M-A-K. And what it is rather than going over, under, over, under, over, under all the way around, we're going to come up by a warp thread. Then we're going to skip a couple, go over 2 or 3, and then we're going to come back 2 or 3. 1, 2, or 3. You can change how many you want to do depending on the look that you want. So right now, I want to do this sumac kind of back and forth in a semicircle here to balance out this. So first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to pull off any extra floof, and I'm going to tuck my roving in between my double warp strand right there, and I'm going to tuck it under this one as well. And that's just to get it out of the way and hide it, secure it. So I just tucked it between those two, and I'm going to work with this. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go down 1 and I'm going to come up right behind it, right there. That's kind of part of my securing. You don't need to do that. So I'm going to consider this warp thread the warp that I am wrapping, and then I'm going to go wrapped warp 1, 2. So I'm going to skip those 2 and I'm going to go down like that. Wrapped warp 1, 2, and then I'm going to come back 1. So I'm going to wrap around this one. This will be my new wrapped warp. Back up. I'm pulling it a little bit snug. And then my wrapped 1, 2. Go down. And then I'm coming back up 1. So this is over 2, back 1. Don't count the 1 that you're wrapping. 1, 2. And I'm going to move this guy over a little bit so he's a little more even. Over 2, back up 1. I'm going to go over 2, back up 1. You notice I'm just using my fingers. I'm going to go over 2, wrapped, 1, 2, back up 1. Now I'm paying attention to color placement here as well, just because I like to do that. So I'm about to transition from the purple to the blue. So wrapped warp, 1, 2, and then back up 1. Now, at this point, I could decide to go back this way, or I think I'm going to go one further. Wrapped, 1, 2, back up 1. Now, I'm back up 1. I'm going to go the other way. First we were going this way around, and now I'm going to go, count this as my wrapped, go 1, 2, and back up 1. I'm going to go over 2, wrapped warp, 1, 2, back up 1. One, 2. Back up 1. And I'm smushing it down. You can see how it's kind of overtaking the plain weave a bit. That's fine. 1, 2. Back up 1. 1, 2. Back up 1. Now I'm going to fasten this off because I'm at my little tail end. So what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to wrap it around, and again I'm going to tuck it through my double strand. You can also just tuck it in the back right there. So I went from my purple to my blue to my green. What I'm going to do here is, because I split it, I'm going to start with my green and I'm going to continue. So I'm going to pick up where I left off, wrap around. I'm going to go wrapped, 1, 2, and then I'm coming back 1. The other way you can turn the corner, or you can turn around depending on how you want the look, is you can wrap it. I came up, I can either skip 2 and come up 1, or I can wrap it around again and come up 1 further. So now I'm going to go 1, 2, 1. It's just a slightly different transition. And I think now, because my spacing is getting farther apart, these lines are going to be shorter. What I'm going to start doing is I'm going to go around, I'm going to go forward 1 and back 1. So here's my wrapped. I'm going to go forward 1. Instead of 2, I'm going forward 1. And then I'm going to go back and wrap it. And I'm going to go forward 1. I'm going to go back and wrap it. I'm going to go forward 1, back and wrap it. Forward 1. You can see the different look. Back and wrap it. Smaller lines. My roving is getting a little twisted. I'm going to untwist it a bit. 1, back and wrap. 1, back and wrap. There we go. Smush it down. Smush it down. Smush it down. There we go. 1, back and wrap. 1, back and wrap. And I'm going to stop a little short, and I want this to look a little bit more braid-like when I get to it. So I'm going to make sure that I'm wrapping all the way around. So I came up. I'm going to come back down. I'm going to come up here, and I'm going to go forward 1, and then come back up. Forward 1, come back up. It almost looks like knitting at this point, the braid. Forward 1, come back up. This technique is called sumac. You can do this with roving, makes for a great texture. You can do this with regular yarn. You can double up your yarn or triple up your yarn. Looks really cool when you have multiple yarns going in this direction. So I'm at the tail end of my roving here, and I think I'm going to kind of just fudge that in, shove it to the back a bit. I like the crescent that I have here, but I do feel that this side is a bit incomplete. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in a pop of yellow in this thick, thin yellow yarn. And you'll see how thick, thin works in weaving. It makes for a really interesting texture. I am going to get the roving out of the way. There we go. I'm going to cut it at a thin point because it makes it easier to tuck away. And I'm going to do the kind of crescent moon here. I'm going to begin it in here and tuck my thick thin in between my double wefts, shoving it back behind. And now I could do sumac with this yarn, but I think I'm just going to do a plain tabby weave. Again, the tabby weave is over, under, because I really like how thick, thin yarns look with a tabby weave. There we go. And you can also manipulate your tabby weave. I'm going to roll this into a little bit of a ball so I don't have to yank through the entire thing in the same way. Just poke it through. You can manipulate the way the yarn looks in the tabby weave, especially when it's a thick, thin yarn like this, because you can just pull up where it's thick and squish down where it's thin. The one thing about the sumac weave is not as stable or sturdy as a tabby weave. So if you were doing this on a non-frame, if you were doing like a traditional tapestry weave on a loom, like the Lily loom from Shocked or a table loom, what you would want to do then is make sure that you lock in your sumac with a little bit of tabby weave in a plain yarn before and after. The sumac again will kind of consume the tabby, so you don't have to worry too much about it showing. You could use even your warp thread if you really wanted it to disappear, but that'll help give your weave structure. Otherwise, the sumac itself is a bit loose to take it off of the frame. At the tail of my yarn, just going to wrap it around the warp thread, tuck it in the back. In this case, I'm just going to use my fingers to shove it under something just to keep it out of the way a little bit. There we go. here we are. I'm going to smush down here where I feel like I need it. And now let's throw some blue in here this way. Maybe we'll do it heavier up here. I'm going to undo my roving. This is a relatively thin one, so I'm not going to split it vertically. What I will do is I think I'll start it over here. This one I am going to wrap, because we're at the edge, I don't want my extra roving to pop through after I've hung my piece. So I'm going to smush down a little bit so I have a little bit more room to work. And I'm really going to try to tuck this tail out of sight as much as possible. We'll shove him down. There we go. Okay, so now I'm going to do a 1 forward, 1 back sumac for a bit. I think I'm going to go back a little bit here, and then I'm going to double back, and then I'll fill in maybe with some white and some hot pink. See what we're playing with. You can see this is where I started. So what I'm doing, this is just going to bridge this gap just a scooch. I don't want it to go all the way around, so I'm going to leave a bit of space there. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch to plain weave right here and really just kind of poof it up a bit, get a bit of a texture difference. So you can see right there, because I don't have a lot of room here, what I can do is just poof. And this color change is also helping me here. So I'm going to go back this way, and by doing that I'll cover this warp thread, and I'm just smushing down so I can get a little bit of room. I'll fluff it back up in a moment. There we go. So here's my fluff. I'm going to pull, floof it up. And this guy, you see what I mean, how this will stick out? We're just going to tuck him, shove him under. You can use our needle and just, I'm using the blunt end of the needle to just poke it in. He's lost. So we're going to shove him under there. There we go. So there we go. So what I think we could use is a bit of pink here, and then maybe cover with a bit of white yarn. So I am going to grab roving, or I have this hot pink yarn. I think I'm going to go with the hot pink yarn. What I'm going to do is I'm going to double this up. This has got a little bit of blue in it. Is that pink enough? No. How about this? That's pink enough. So we're going to double this yarn up so it has a bit more weight, especially at the end. This is a relatively thin DK weight yarn. There's maybe some Noro that I wound off. So I may actually even quadruple it. So I'm folding it in half, my length of yarn. I'm folding in half. I am going to quadruple it, and I'll show you a neat trick that you can do if you're doubling or quadrupling yarns. You have the length of yarn. Go around your warp thread and just, this is going to be my quadrupled, so it's just attached just like that. Now you only have one end to deal with. I am going to thread this onto a needle because it's a thinner yarn and I'm running out of space. And this will just give me a bit more manipulation to go in. In this case, I'm actually going to do sumac with this yarn, and we'll see how that turns out if we like it. I think it could be an interesting texture, especially because you can see the multiple strands. I'm going to wrap this warp, and then I'm going to fasten off. And the way I'm going to fasten off this yarn is I'm going to thread it on my needle. Because if you notice, roving will kind of stay where you put it. Yarn sometimes won't. So I'm actually going to make sure that this goes under one of its neighbors. And then we'll tuck it back under here and keep it out of the way. All right, there we go. So here's my pink. And I'm going to finish this side with a bit of white. I always like using white because it adds a bit of a refreshing look. Gives a place for the eye to rest. In our case, the yellow also gives a place for the eye to rest. It's not as dynamic, but it'll also soften up a bit of this pink. Now I want to feather in the white, so I'm going to start here. There's my back. I'm going to leave that tail there and I'll deal with that. This I'm going to do as a plain weave. And here I'm actually going to, because I don't necessarily want to come all the way back here. Again, I'm going to go back and forth. I do not want to split my roving. And then I'm going to continue forward because I want to get a little bit of that look right there. And then I'm going to smush down so you can see what I'm doing. And we're going to use the white to fill in right here. All right, now we're at the very end and we're filling in our last little spaces. Now I'm not too worried if I can't get it all totally filled in because you can see I can really manipulate by squishing. The very technical term of squish. And get in where I need to get in, and then I can go back and do the same thing the other way. So I've got my, I'm going to smush that out a little bit. I'm going to work until my yarn is out. and kind of just really fill this in a bit. Get a little of that texture and tuck in my ends like so. Now I'm going to manipulate my weaving a bit. I'm going to stretch out the blue where I want it stretched. There we go. There we go. I've got my white stripe. So this little guy here needs to be addressed. I'm going to tuck him under there. I'm going to use my needle. You can use a crochet hook as well. That'll work. That actually works great. To just tuck your tails under. And when you do, just make sure that you don't see it from the front. And that's really all you're doing. You're just securing it enough that they won't go anywhere while you're working on stuff or up against the wall. Then I'm going to trim. I'm going to leave a little bit free, just again because movement. I'll fluff up anything I think will fluff up. My tool's out of the way. And now I'm going to decide which side is up. I think I like it like this. There we go. Remember that outer ring that we talked about before? Knocking things over. Here's my outer ring. I'm just going to pop it over. Tighten it up. And voila, your weave is framed. Now you're all set to hang it up. You can just hang it on a little nail right there. You can tie ribbon to it, what have you. So that's how you create a tapestry circle weave. Thanks again for watching. Remember, you can follow us at yarnia.com, shopyarnia.com. You can follow us on Instagram as Shop Yarnia, and you can follow us on Facebook as Yarnia LLC. Thanks so much. Happy weaving!